I made some bad decisions, and I was young. I just wasn't carrying myself like I was supposed to.
T.O. Sullivan on third down. Going to lob that toward Chris Henry. 6 points.
Touchdown.
Be smart tonight. Don't drink and drive. Don't speed. Make good decisions.
101 NFL games, 4 seasons, a fiance, 3 kids, a wedding set for March. Chris Henry didn't retire. He didn't get cut. He was 26 years old, and his career was finally going somewhere. Best season of his life, clean, stable, on the verge of everything. And then he was gone. By the end, you'll know what doctors found inside his brain and why it changes everything. Belle Chasse, Louisiana doesn't send many kids to the NFL. But in 2005, Chris Henry got the call in the 3rd round, 83rd overall, from the Cincinnati Bengals. A wide receiver out of West Virginia who stood 6 foot 4 inches tall with hands that could pluck anything out of the air and route running that made defensive backs look lost. The kind of player coaches dream about developing. But if you asked his family, they'd tell you about someone the headlines never showed. Someone warm and funny who spoke in this quiet voice that didn't match the chaos following him around. His fiancée Lolaine had 3 kids with him, Chris Jr., little Sainey, and baby DeMarcus. And his teammates would tell you he lit up the whole locker room just by walking in. After every touchdown, Chris would tap his heart and point to his mother Carolyn in the stands. Their signal. One love. That person almost never made it into a story. The arrests did. The pattern started early and it followed him everywhere. Impulsive decisions that didn't make sense. Explosive reactions that seemed to come out of nowhere. The league watched it all pile up, arrest after arrest. Headlines that made him look reckless, unstable, out of control. December 2005. Pulled over in northern Kentucky with marijuana in his shoes. No valid license. A month later, gun charges in Orlando wearing his number 15 jersey. Then came June 2006. Flying down Interstate 275 at 1 in the morning, doing 82 and a 65 with a blood alcohol level over the legal limit. By March 2008, a Cincinnati judge looked at his record and called him a one-man crime wave in open court. And that's when the league stepped in. In April 2007, Roger Goodell had just taken over as commissioner and rolled out the league's new personal conduct policy. Chris Henry became one of the very first examples of an 8-game suspension alongside his old West Virginia teammate, Adam Pac-Man Jones. Goodell's public statement landed hard. We must protect the integrity of the NFL. The highest standards of conduct must be met by everyone in the NFL because it is a privilege to represent the NFL, not a right. But here's what nobody saw coming. Henry showed up to training camp in 2009 with a new tattoo below his left ear. One word: blessed. When people asked how he was doing after everything, he'd tell them straight. I kind of felt like I dug myself out of the hole and started doing the right things. People say, "How you feeling now, Chris? You doing all right?" I just tell them I'm blessed. That's why I got it.
I just changed my whole life around, man. I stopped hanging out with a lot of people that I used to, stopped going a lot of places, and I told myself I wasn't going to make bad decisions anymore. You know, I was going to be smart about everything, and that's all I've been doing. He
caught a touchdown in all 4 preseason games. When the regular season kicked off, he was playing the best football of his career. Led the team with 19.7 yards per catch, put up 236 yards and 2 touchdowns. Marvin Lewis said there was a different man sitting across from me, a different person. A continual growth of Chris both on and off the field. Bengals owner Mike Brown saw it.
I have to admit I am fond of Chris Henry. I've seen him struggle.
He had worked through the troubles in his life and had finally seemingly reached the point where everything was going to blossom. He was finally becoming the player the Bengals drafted him to be. He was supposed to be entering his prime. He did end up becoming what the league feared, just not in the way anyone imagined. What nobody realized at the time was that every arrest and every suspension the NFL punished him for had nothing to do with football, and everything to do with what football had already done to him. Looking back at the timeline, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. He was arrested 5 times across 4 years, with multiple suspensions totaling over 14 games. Every single one was tied to the same pattern: impulse, explosion, and inability to see consequences coming until it was too late. Goodell made Henry one of the first examples under the new personal conduct policy, and the NFL's narrative was airtight. This is a character problem, plain and simple. But stop for a second. Every hit you take in an NFL career is like making a deposit into an account you didn't know you opened. It doesn't show up on a sideline scan or give you a warning. It just sits there accumulating, and one of the first things it starts taking is your impulse control, the part of your brain that stops you from crossing a line you can't uncross. That is the exact symptoms for which the league was suspending Chris Henry for. He had never had a documented concussion at West Virginia, never showed up on an NFL injury report with anything related to his head. But Dr. Bennett Amalu, the pathologist who discovered CTE in Steelers legend Mike Webster's brain, would later break it down. The brain floats freely in your skull. If you're moving very quickly and suddenly stop, the brain bounces. And over time, with repetition, that causes big problems. Chris Henry played wide receiver, which meant he ran routes across the middle where safeties came downhill at full speed. He caught 119 passes across 55 games in his NFL career, and every single reception came with contact. Every collision was a transaction, and his brain was paying a price nobody could see. On November 8, 2009, the Bengals were playing Baltimore, and Chris caught a 20-yard pass before cornerback Fabian Washington brought him down. When Washington's weight came down on him, Henry's left forearm snapped clean just above the wrist. You could see it on the replay, the bone bowing under pressure before it gave. He got placed on injured reserve the next day. The season that was supposed to be his breakthrough ended with a cast on his arm and a flight to Charlotte to recover at Lolaney's family home. And then came the moment that would end everything. Fast forward to December 16th, 2009. There was an argument at the house. Lolaney got into her mother's pickup truck and tried to drive away. Chris jumped into the bed of the truck as she pulled out. Witnesses saw him standing in the back, pounding on the rear window with his casted arm. The truck was going maybe 20 miles per hour, well under the 35-mile-per-hour speed limit. And then he fell. His head hit the pavement on Oakdale Road. When paramedics arrived, he was already unresponsive. They rushed him to Carolina's Medical Center, and doctors worked 18 hours before declaring him brain dead. On December 17th, 2009, 6:36 in the morning, Chris Henry was gone at 26 years old. Police ruled it an accident, but the toxicology report showed no alcohol in his system. And then, in the middle of all that grief, his mother made a decision that would change everything we know about this story and save 4 lives in the process. What they found when they looked inside Chris Henry's brain is something the NFL has never spoken about publicly, but the science speaks for itself. In the hours after her son's death, Carolyn Henry Glaspie made a choice most people can't imagine making. She donated his organs. Brian Polk received a kidney. James Benton got the liver. Donna Arnold received the pancreas and a second kidney. Thomas Elliott got both lungs. A 5th person received his heart, but died before Carolyn could meet them. 4 people are walking around alive right now because of Chris Henry. It was the first act of grace in a story the world had spent years framing as a cautionary tale about character. But Carolyn made one more decision that day. She donated his brain to science. 6 months later, on June 28, 2010, West Virginia University called a news conference. Dr. Julian Bales sat at the table. Chairman of neurosurgery at WVU, former team doctor for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Next to him sat Dr. Bennett Amalu, the California medical examiner who discovered CTE in Mike Webster's brain 8 years before and basically dragged the NFL into admitting the disease existed. Dr. Amalu examined tissue samples from Chris's brain using the same techniques he'd developed for Webster's case. Normal brain cells show up blue and clean, And what they found in Chris Henry's brain, nobody in that room was prepared for. The cells came back discolored, clumpy, filled with threads and tangles that had no business being there in someone his age. Dr. Bales said there was fairly extensive damage throughout his brain that was fully consistent with CTE. Dr. Amalu was more direct. It didn't look like the brain of a 26-year-old. The diagnosis? Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. Extensive damage throughout his brain was among the most severe cases ever recorded in someone so young at that point in medical history. Chris Henry became the 22nd professional football player ever diagnosed with CTE. But he was the first active NFL player still on a roster, still collecting paychecks from the league to get that diagnosis. And he was the youngest person ever confirmed with the disease, with no concussions on his medical records. No reputation as someone who played recklessly or hunted for heads. Just a wide receiver who ran routes and caught passes the same way thousands of other players were doing every Sunday. And here's where it becomes impossible to look away. The symptoms of CTE line up perfectly with every behavior the NFL suspended him for. Impulsivity that comes out of nowhere. Poor judgment in situations where you should know better. Explosive emotional reactions that don't match what's happening. Inability to see consequences before you act. Depression that settles in and won't leave. Issues with substance. Relationships that fall apart no matter how hard you're trying to hold them together. Dr. Bales didn't dance around it. CTE carries specific neurobehavioral symptoms. Typically failure at personal and business relationships, use of drugs and alcohol, depression. When Carolyn heard the diagnosis, she said it hit her like a shock. I knew nothing about my 26-year-old son's underlying condition or the disease. But some of it makes sense with some of the behavioral patterns in Chris, just like mood swings and the headaches he'd been having. The man the league spent years publicly calling a conduct problem had a degenerative brain disease rewiring who he was. His behavior wasn't a character flaw. It was brain damage. Chris Henry wasn't a cautionary tale about character. He was a cautionary tale about what the game costs and who pays the price. The question isn't whether the NFL knew CTE existed by 2009. The question is how long they were going to pretend they didn't. While suspending the players, it was destroying. The NFL's personal conduct policy wasn't designed to protect players. It was designed to protect the brand. Roger Goodell rolled it out in April 2007, months after taking over as commissioner. Chris Henry became one of the first targets of an 8-game suspension. A public warning from the commissioner himself, the entire league watching. Henry became its face, the first high-profile example Goodell made, while the league continued profiting from the game that was causing his deterioration. The policy gave the commissioner the power to suspend players based on arrests alone. You didn't need a conviction or charges that would stick, just bad optics. It let the NFL frame struggling players as character issues, while the game itself kept breaking them in ways nobody watching on Sundays could see. By 2013, the truth had gotten too big to keep sweeping under the rug. More than 4,500 former players filed lawsuits. The NFL came back with a settlement offer. $765 million spread across roughly 1,800 retired players. A federal judge looked at the numbers and said it wasn't even close to enough money to cover what was coming. So the final settlement approved in 2015 climbed past $1 billion, designed to cover around 25,000 retired players over 65 years. Families of players diagnosed posthumously with CTE, players like Chris Henry, could receive up to $4 million under the terms. The league called it condolences. Science called it CTE. Here's what the settlement actually protected. The NFL never had to admit liability. League officials never had to testify under oath about what they knew and when they knew it. All those internal documents everyone wanted to see, emails, memos, research studies, stayed locked away. Chris Henry's mother spent years fighting to tell the real story of who her son was. His 3 kids grew up without a father, and the league had spent years publicly labeling him as a distraction. Leilani never got the March wedding they'd been planning. At Chris's funeral, she said something that cut through all the noise. People say I helped change his life. No, he changed mine. And about 11 months after Chris died, Carolyn traveled to a hospital in North Carolina, where she met all 4 people alive because of her son's organs. She put her ear against Thomas Elliott's chest and listened to her son's lungs still breathing, still working, still alive inside someone else. She hugged Brian Polk, James Benton, and Donna Arnold, and she said she could feel Chris in every one of them. I got my closure when I listened to that man's chest and I could hear Chris's lungs inside of him. I cried because that's my son helping him breathe. Every time we watch a massive collision and cheer, there's a deposit going into an account we never see. The NFL is counting on us to keep cheering anyway. Chris Henry's brain was the receipt showing exactly what that costs. The NFL gave Chris Henry suspensions across multiple actions and called it accountability. Science gave him a diagnosis and called it CTE. One of those answers came 6 months too late to matter, and it wasn't the one that came from the NFL. Chris Henry didn't die because he was a bad person. He died because the game he loved was doing something to his brain that nobody in power wanted to look at closely enough to see. And his mother's decision to donate his organs and his brain is the only reason the truth came out at all. So, if this story made you think differently, hit that like button, comment on what you want us to cover next, and subscribe for more stories like this. You won't want to miss them.